sort of thing. So just a brief introduction to Advent generally, and then I just very briefly wanted to remind you of other things going on here at Trinity at Advent. Of course, you'll have the alternative giving options, supporting a few different possible helpful options for those who have everything anyhow. So give it to somewhere else. We also have gifts for the Christ child. I've been asked to remind you that it would be really helpful if you had those in by next week so that they can go ahead with purchasing the gift cards for families before children go off on their holiday break. So that's a bit of a time crunch. And then, of course, I did put the hat on, Julie.
Thank you.
Anybody at the 8 o'clock service, can you back me up on that?
Yeah.
I put the hat on to remind you St. Nicholas dinner is this coming Wednesday. The sign-up sheet is right there if for some reason you haven't yet signed up. Lessons and carols follows this, so even if you went to the early service, you can stick around and we'll do lessons and carols. It won't be much of a repeat from what we did earlier. And then there's a couple of sort of devotional. Some of it is actually. There's the Advent calendar, which is posted up on the bulletin board over there. You'll see that. My encouragement is to take one, color it in day by day, share it with your family if you have others in the household to share it with. And then we can bring them back during the 12 days of Christmas and see what we've come up with. I was telling somebody one day last week as I handed her one of those Advent calendars. In Medford, I had, and we have artistic folks here too, so I'm sort of throwing out the challenge. But I had a parishioner in Medford who one year decided that she wanted to make her page of panels into a 3D sculpture.
Wow.
So she cut things out and put them on springs, and she created some kind of structure, which was spending way too much time on that. But she liked it, so there you go. So she was thinking, oh, it was beautiful, it was stunning. So you don't be fixed with colored pencils and think that's all you have to do. But if you want to do more, you can do more. So that's your Advent calendars. Advent word, just a brief moment. Today's word is awaken, and I went online this morning to check and see where we're doing. I'm refreshing the screen now to see what might come up. The word is awaken, and as you go through that, you'll see that people put different images. Apparently somebody even put a video for what that word might mean for them. So you get some really beautiful images to help us think about a word. A word
Slow
is
it down. There. You can see the image now.
So, I haven't posted mine yet. Stay tuned. I'll create some kind of collage over there, taking the place of what you see is a series of pictures there documenting the field trip several of us took this week. We went out and got 3 Christmas trees for St. Helens because that's where our 4 o'clock service will be on Christmas Eve, as well as the labyrinth the weekend before. So stay tuned. More to come. We're going to continue now with the video for this week, second Sunday of a 5-part series. Any comments before we do about last week? Because I wasn't here, so I don't know what you thought of it.
You liked it.
Yeah.
You thought it was good.
I heard a bunch of people say that they were going to go back and read it.
The
Because
whole
they
book.
haven't read it in a long
I
time.
haven't read it in a long time.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, he's going to help us figure out how to read it differently than some of our brothers and sisters read it. Okay. Well, let's get to it then. Michael Battle and part 2.
So we are moving now to the second part of my book, Heaven on Earth, God's Call to Community in the Book of Revelation. And the second part is about the nightmares, the horrible beasts and the violence and the heads rolling and the blood flowing. It's not surprising that this gets the most attention in the book of Revelation. We are entertained by violence. Just think about it. You can't really win an Academy Award unless there's a really compelling conflict. We need conflict. I don't think we need to be entertained by it. Conflict is a way in which we think about moving from thresholds, moving through rites of passage, maturing. We need healthy conflict, not to settle in a life in which we know that there's a lot more that God is calling from us, but to live in the conflict in which God is actually calling out this person called us in God's image. So as we think about Revelation's nightmares, I'm getting us into why I entitled the book Heaven on Earth. Because heaven is not separated from earth. Heaven is literally God's presence. And the psalmist says, no matter where we run, God is with us. And I think if we can understand that kind of theology, that it's not about waiting for the afterlife, it's not about seeking God beyond this reality, it's about trying to see what is already there. And I think there are clues to the book of Revelation that John of Patmos also thought the same thing. He did not separate heaven and earth. There was a war in heaven. And also, if you look at the structure of the book of Revelation, when John has a vision in heaven, that vision is also seen on earth. The structure for the book of Revelation is always correlating heaven and earth. So if you look through, if you take your time and read through the book of Revelation again, notice that each of those dreams he has of monsters or whatever, they are correlated between heaven and earth. So the nightmares. Let's return back to one of the video clips, which I think answers why John has nightmares. But in this season of Advent, we also have the gospel lesson that gives us a nightmare. The Gospel of Mark. But in those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken.
To understand the true meaning of the book, we need to go back to its roots. According to the Bible, John wrote Revelation on the island of Patmos off the Turkish coast, at that time under the control of the Roman Empire.
John tells his audience that he's on the island because of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus. Whenever the book of Revelation mentions the testimony of Jesus, it connects it to suffering. In fact, the Greek word martus for witness has become our word martyr, and it takes that usage first in the book of Revelation.
If John was suffering on Patmos, then was he a prisoner of the Romans? Ian Boxall is an expert on the author of Revelation.
This is the cave where, according to tradition, John has his visions. You can see the place over there where traditionally he laid his head, and then, not being quite so agile, there's a grip for him to lever himself up. John, according to all the traditions, is here as an exile. They differ precisely as to why he was here, who exiled him, but they all agree that he was here as a result of his Christian belief.
Although there is no archaeological evidence of a Roman prison, the location of the island suggests it served a military purpose. Patmos may have been one of a number of fortress islands defending the important Roman seaport of Miletus, about 40 miles away on the mainland. It was an ideal place to detain exiles. But if John was in exile, it seems strange that he had the freedom to find a cave, see visions, write them down, and then to send the documents to his churches back on the mainland. This may well be due to the way Rome exiled troublemakers.
When Roman authorities would place someone in exile, he would have had quite a bit of freedom. He wouldn't have been imprisoned. He would have only been excluded from appearing in certain regions, or he would have been told that he had to restrict his movements to just this one island. But he may have been able to carry on a correspondence through intermediaries who would sail from the island back to the mainland and return, so that he may have been able to keep in touch with the churches he was addressing.
Despite this freedom to communicate, John was still trapped on Patmos, separated from the Christian churches in Asia Minor. This sense of frustration may have led John to write Revelation with its violent images of worldwide catastrophe. The theory is that John was furious with the Romans for persecuting him and his fellow Christians.
There's a lot of anger in Revelation and a yearning for justice to be done. And that's often been seen as a direct result of Roman persecution of Christians.
So, there's a reason for the nightmares. John of Patmos most likely was like Nelson Mandela, exiled on an island, fighting an empire. So the context for the book of Revelation is very important. Instead of understanding just these stream of conscious images, you have to understand why they are there. Many of the beasts and monsters are symbolic of Babylon or symbolic of this Roman occupying force. And so to understand the book of Revelation, we must understand the nightmares, but those nightmares are not meant to be put in some sort of linear fashion to say some U.S. president is this beast or this event has to happen before the next consequential event. No, John of Patmos is dreaming in exile. And there's something about exile that many of us Western folk in the Western world have forgotten. In much of antiquity and in much of the non-Western world today, there is a fate worse than death, and it's called exile. Being in exile was seen as a fate worse than death. Being away from your people, being away from that which brought you identity, being away from your community, was seen as worse than death, is seen as worse than death. But in our more individualistic societies, perhaps we are not in touch with that understanding and context the way other cultures around the world still are. But there are people, for example, who are incarcerated, who would rather kill themselves than to be in some solitary block. that is an example, perhaps, in our westernized world to display what I'm trying to say about a fate worse than death. So John's nightmares are not the foci of the book of Revelation. They are the means in which John of Patmos is trying to communicate to his flock, to the congregation, since most scholars believe he carried some spiritual authority. And so, can you imagine someone who is used to being up front, used to being given authority, now in exile? As we think about the reasons for the nightmares, the context is important. So, too, is the context for the good dreams that we'll talk more about later. But I think it's important to pause and to talk about why there are good dreams, why there are perceptions of heaven. But as we are about to see, perceptions of heaven in the Western world are not the same for John of Patmos.
To give you an idea of the hold heaven has on us, in a survey by ABC News, nearly 9 out of 10 Americans said they believe heaven exists. And most assume they're going there at the end of their lives.
This life is not what we're made for. We're made for heaven. We're made for the future.
All these years on earth are only to get to the next place?
Absolutely.
That Roman Catholic viewpoint is shared by millions of Muslims as well.
The real life is the next life. And based upon how we live this life, it determines where we shall be in the next.
But heaven is not just about religion. It has become a staple of popular American culture. Our perfect pitch lines for advertisers who believe when it comes to selling, nothing is sacred.
And my heart beats so that I can hardly speak.
And heaven is a thread woven into the tapestry of American music. Eric Clapton's fans grieved with him over the accidental death of his 4-year-old son. After the death of her close friend Whitney Houston, Alicia Keys serenaded her in heaven.
And it's a long, long way to heaven, but I gotta get there.
Melissa Etheridge's rock and roll lyrics, meanwhile, see heaven as much closer to home.
Heaven is here. Heaven is here.
It was Bob Dylan, a Jewish boy from the Midwest, who turned the idea of dying and going to heaven into an anthem for a generation. From unforgettable lyrics to memorable lines.
If you don't change who you are, then you won't go to heaven.
Many of us draw our most vivid impressions of heaven not by sitting in front of the pulpit,
God, I gotta ask you something. What's the meaning of life?
but by sitting in front of television and movie screens.
Bruce, I'm God.
Bingo! Yahtzee!
So for us in the Western world, there is usually a bifurcation of John of Patmos's nightmares and John of Patmos's good dreams of heaven. But in the Christian tradition of spirituality, especially for the desert fathers and mothers, there was no such bifurcation. For example, those in the spiritual traditions like Pseudo-Dionysius and St. Anthony said that the way in which we enter into heaven, being one with God, being in union with God, that was heaven, is you had to go through purgation first. And then once you make it through purgation, illumination occurs. And then after illumination, union with God. A threefold movement to God. Purgation, illumination, union. But you couldn't separate the purgation from the union. It's similar to Isaiah's vision of having to be burned in order to be in the presence of God. The work for us in understanding the book of Revelation and also the work of understanding the coming of Christ is one in which we have to enter a paradox that heaven and earth cannot be separated. They are inextricably linked together. And all of the nightmares that John of Patmos has in the book of Revelation are ways in which he is moving through that threefold journey to God, being purged through those nightmares to eventually land with that healing tree. Julian of Norwich says that the holier she becomes, the more aware she is of her sin. The holier she becomes, the more aware she is of her sin. In other words, when we are in the presence of God, that's going to feel like a nightmare. When we are in the presence of the one who is apocalyptic, that is the one who reveals who we truly are, there will be some growth that will occur as God is making us more like God. So heaven on earth. So for me, there is a reason why we have separated heaven and earth. There's a reason why Marx, in many ways, is right to say that Christians have tried to be an opiate to society. He's right in the sense that we have divided heaven and earth, and we have excused behavior to allow injustice now. And we have said to those who are suffering that it's going to be okay by and by. It's going to be okay in the future. It's going to be okay even in the afterlife. I think that not only makes John of Patmos angry, I think that makes Jesus angry. If you look at the way Jesus encountered people, Jesus knew that we all were going to die. Jesus knew that the blind man was going to die. Jesus knew that the deaf person was going to die. So why was he trying to heal their blindness or heal their deafness if he knew in his grand scheme of things that 1 million years is like a minute? Why would he even care about doing these little pedantic things of caring for the human body? But I think Jesus was trying to get us to imprint upon him, to understand that what matters now matters eternally. And in our Christian faith, we even believe that the resurrection is not just of some ethereal mind, like in some Star Trek movie, but as Christians, we believe in the resurrection of all that we are, even our body. So heaven on earth, as an inextricably linked reality, is very important. But we distort that truth. And theologians, philosophers, social scientists are saying that we now live in what's called a post-truth era. That we're so individualistic, truth is so relativized, it's just your truth over and against my truth. And for me, John the Baptist is giving us a bit of an antidote to that, to say that we are inextricably linked together and that we cannot live in a post-truth era very long. There is a truth for all of us. Context matters, but truth matters as well. For example, Dylan Storm Roof, who entered a church in 2015, had his own truth. He called himself a Christian, and he went in and he had a Bible study on this passage in Mark chapter 4. And he joined the Bible study, and he identified actually with being the seed in the good soil. And then after they said a prayer together, he rose and he killed his Bible study. And he said he was doing this as a just act. His truth. As Christians, we can no longer relativize truth. And we can no longer put up with those who continue to change the standards, the essence of truth. And just like Pontius Pilate, who asked what is truth when truth was standing right in front of him, breathing on him, we too will endanger our species if we cannot understand the truth right in front of our face.
My name is Francis Fubiyama. I'm a senior fellow at Stanford and director of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law and a political scientist. Someone mentioned this concept that I'd not heard of previously called a post-truth society, in which it's possible to assert things that have no factual basis. People will criticize it, fact checkers, and it makes no difference whatsoever that people keep asserting it, and then other, large numbers of people keep believing it, even if it's not true. And that's an effect that's going to last way beyond the election, unfortunately. I think that once you sort of breach these norms, you're in this undefined territory where anything can go, and I don't think we've plumbed the depths of that, unfortunately. I think that a post-truth society it's a reflection of something deeper, which is the basic lack of authority, or the decline of authority of institutions across the board. And this is not just in the United States, this is in Europe and other places as well. So if you think about the things that defined our society, they were corporations, labor unions, a family, churches, political parties, these are the things that structured our social and political life. Every single one of those, if you look at polling data over the last 40, 50 years, every single one of those institutions has seen a decline in the number of people saying they trust those institutions. The causes of this, I think, are kind of complicated. I think actually technology plays a role, because a lot of these institutions have actually become much, much more transparent. And when people actually see the way that they function in reality, they don't like it, even though there's actually been no change. And so, for example, I suspect if you actually look at police shootings over time, it's been declining along with the crime rate over the last 30 years. But now that you've got body cameras and people with smartphones, it's much more visible, because ordinary citizens can take videos of things that have been happening for the last, couple of generations. So I think that's something that's been going on across the board that's led to this steady erosion in the confidence in public institutions.
I think John of Patmos would agree with Mahatma Gandhi that ultimately what we seek in truth is God. His concept of ahimsa, his concept of truth is always related to God. And Gandhi often joked that, he doesn't like Christianity, but he likes Jesus. And I think there's a lot of truth in that as well. As we are trying to figure out how heaven on earth is controversial for some of us Christians who would rather have a heaven beyond earth or bifurcated realities. My argument is that it's incumbent upon us and an imperative among us that we must see the interrelation between heaven and earth. Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven has already come near to you. So even Jesus is trying to help us see this movement, this interrelationship between heaven and earth. And if we don't try to practice that liminal space, then ultimately I think this post-truth era takes over. And so these individualistic heavens, these nightmares by some who think that they have a word from God, can create anarchy, can create the kinds of definitions of the book of Revelation that many people think of as this dystopian way of life. So the question that I'd like for us to have a discussion about is this one. Do most Western world folk believe in a theology in which salvation is ultimately personal?
When I observe all of the tensions that we're going through now, it really does seem to stem from an individual theology and an individual understanding of heaven, which is, it's deeply rooted, and it's hard to have a discussion without tempers flaring, and even when everyone's coming from the best place, and both sides think they're good in doing God's work, it's really difficult to get past all of that and have a discussion about why my goodness might be harming you.
I'm afraid to the question I have to give the ultimate Anglican answer, yes and no. Yes, we have portrayed salvation, we've portrayed faith itself as so individualistic and personal in our culture, and that becomes even more solidified and calcified when we turn truth into rectitude. And my position is right. And some other position may be a different truth, but it is not right because it's not my particular tradition or my particular rectitude. However, the no part, I'm thinking of my own life and being with people of faith, not just Christians, but people, many people of different faiths and of a faith pathway. Every time, almost, every time there's an authentic experience of truth in the broadest, the deepest, the most hopeful sense, it draws us to each other. It draws us to God. I'm reminded that truth comes from an Anglo-Saxon word, troth, which used to be in the old prayer book that happened at weddings, some of you. That's a little odd kind of footnote. But what it really means is trust. And truth authentically always explodes isolation and brings trust with it. And perhaps the question of the joining of heaven on earth and heaven in earth and earth in heaven is one of how we break through the isolation, the individualism, the selfishness, to discover trust with God and trust with each other.
For Western, a lot of Western folks, at least the ones that I know, that salvation is a personal choice. And I think it's interesting as we're talking about heaven, if our heaven is also individually tailored, how lonely that would be. So I feel like it's in our eternal interest to have a communal salvation. Because it would be really lonely to spend eternity alone in one's ideal environment, but without anyone else.
So my simplistic answer to the question, do most Western folk believe in a theology in which salvation is ultimately personal? My simple answer is yes, and I would say I am complicit in that as well. So reading your book, I felt as though I have this house in my head with all this stuff in it, and I have to unpack the house to make room for new stuff to come in. So your book is so riveting and changing my mind, my mindset, my attitude, my perspective about what it means to be getting into heaven. I see that heaven is about us being together, and it's not a personal choice anymore. It has to be a choice that we make together.
I think your comments remind us of therein lies the problem. Do most Western folks believe in a theology in which salvation is ultimately personal? The answer, again, simplistically is yes. But we have to look at what the roots are of people's getting to that belief, and how willing people are to continue to learn and be stretched, and to have that which has been so much a part of us challenged, not just by the author or by a colleague, but literally to go deep inside ourselves and to realize that that which we've learned and that which we know is not static, and that we are continuously being made new, and that revelation is continuing. And that's, I think, one of the most difficult things for us as Western folks, because we learn it, we know it, we own it, we keep it, and nothing else can break through. You're inviting us into a journey into a deeper place, and many people don't want what they believe to be disturbed by the depth of a deeper place. And so that's the place of resistance, I think, and I think that's also the place of resistance to revelation. You know, let that be over there, because I know what I know, and I know what I know is going to get me into heaven, and I know that what I know is going to get me into heaven is unchangeable and unshakable, so please don't disturb me.
I just want to go back to Regina's story. The reason why we are faced with so many challenges inside Christianity, and we have this war and this like religion versus just denomination versus denomination, is I think like a lot of these other denominations, they literally take Revelation for what it means and not take it to fit our lives in the 21st century and how we are supposed to interpret it to move forward in Christianity.
Bill Jackson's a vicar?
Well, they do something after he stopped being
I didn't know that. All right. Comments, questions, observations? I'm going to turn the light on so you can see each other. Well, anybody?
Well, I was particularly interested in the comments that he made about Jesus's life and the miracles and the things that Jesus participated in during his lifetime, which were to mitigate some of the problems and the things that people were suffering within this life, and that was an emphasis of Jesus, and not saying to them, oh, don't worry about being poor and hungry and cold and blind or deaf, because everything's going to be okay after you die.
Well, Jesus, as a Jew, Jews did not have a well-developed theory of an afterlife, especially the Pharisees. The Sadducees had no notion of afterlife whatsoever. The temple priests.
You can't hear.
So everything, well, Jews had no particular notion of an afterlife. Pharisees had a kind of attenuated one. Sadducees had no notion of an afterlife whatsoever. So everything was about, salvation was about here and now. Salvation was about taking care of each other here and now. So Jesus is, in terms of the way he's being depicted here, both by Michael Battle and within the New Testament, he's being completely consistent with his own spiritual background. That dualism between heaven and earth is Hellenistic. It's not Jewish. And so Jesus' perspective, in fact, it's one of the few things I'm pretty sure about him. I'm one of these people who makes Mary Ann Ward look conservative at times. So it's rather difficult to do. But we'll talk sometime publicly, and you'll see that actually I can turn her, get to the left of her even. But he didn't have. One of the things I'm really sure about this guy is that for him, heaven was about here and now. Not because of what particularly he said, but because his spiritual tradition was entirely rooted in that notion.
So Bill was, for those of you in the back who are saying I can't hear, Bill's talking about how ill-defined, if at all existent, the notion of heaven after death was for many Jews in Jesus' time. But the anecdote I often bring up to that point is in Acts, there's a wonderful story where Paul's finding himself in conflict, and he pits the Sadducees against the Pharisees because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, and it's his way of getting the heat off him. Go fight amongst yourselves. It's a wonderful little moment in that whole unfolding of things. But it's evidence within the canon of the Bible itself of just how uncertain people were in Jesus' time. Well, it's 10 o'clock. I'll leave you with that, though perhaps there's more to ponder. Shall we continue this next week?
Yes.
I'll add as a bit of a footnote. I had my attention captured early on by his rather helpful and I think vivid explanation of what John's situation was. Grounding it in that kind of a sense of context, because context is always so helpful when we try and read these things. 21st century American context poorly translates often back into what we're reading in the Bible. So it's very helpful to start where it starts before we try and figure out what it means for us. So that was, I thought, really quite lovely a moment in the whole thing. So, all right, well, I'll leave you to it. Lessons and carols. I have to go find my funny vestments and get ready for things.
What time is it?